Hello and welcome to Cheating Message. Subscribe to the channel by clicking on the bell to not miss new videos. And don't forget to like us because it's the best support for us. Emma Harper stood in the wings of the Grand Theater, her heart racing with adrenaline as she prepared for what would be her final performance. The soft hum of the orchestra tuning filled the air, blending with the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain. At 27, Emma was at the peak of her career, a ballerina whose name graced the most prestigious stages around the world. Her heart swelled with pride as she remembered the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the pain endured to reach this point. Ballet was her life. It was the very air she breathed. As the curtain rose and the first strains of music began, Emma felt the familiar surge of energy. She leapt into the opening movement, her body moving as if it had been born for this moment. The world around her disappeared, leaving only the dance. It was perfection, but then it happened. A split second, a momentary lapse in balance. Her ankle gave way with a sharp, searing pain. She fell hard, the gasps from the audience barely registering in her mind. Through the haze of agony, she tried to rise, but her leg refused to cooperate. The performance came to a screeching halt as stagehands rushed to her side. The music abruptly cut off. The ambulance ride blurred by, a whirlwind of flashing lights and panicked faces. Her mind raced with one thought. Please, let it be something I can recover from. I need to dance again. The next few days were a fog of hospital rooms and tests. The worst news came swiftly, delivered with an unsettling calm by her doctor. Her injury was serious. Severe tendon damage. Her career as a ballerina was over. There was no way she could continue at the level she had once achieved. Emma's world collapsed in on itself. The studio apartment she returned to felt like a tomb. She sat on her couch, staring blankly at the wall, the weight of her loss settling in. Dance had been everything. Her identity, her future, her purpose. Without it, she felt like a shell of herself. Her boyfriend, Mark, came by that night. She had expected him to comfort her, to say something that would bring a glimmer of hope. Instead, he paced the room, avoiding eye contact. "Mark," she whispered, her voice brittle. "Say something." He stopped, sighed deeply, and then said the words that broke her heart further. "Emma, I don't know if I can do this." "What are you talking about?" She looked at him, pleading. I've been thinking, and with you not dancing anymore, I don't know what's left for us." He fumbled with his words, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't staying. Emma watched in silence as he packed a bag, offering no words of comfort, no explanations that would make this hurt any less. When the door clicked shut behind him, she sat in the oppressive silence, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The following weeks dragged on in a haze of despair. She avoided her friends, ignored calls, and spent most days staring out the window, trying to make sense of a future that felt bleak and meaningless. Her body, once her proudest instrument, now felt like a prison. But amidst the darkness, a glimmer of light appeared. Her former ballet teacher, Madame Lena, called persistently, refusing to let Emma wallow in isolation. Eventually, she gave in and agreed to meet. Madame Lena was as regal as ever, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her sharp eyes filled with concern. They met in a small cafe, and after exchanging pleasantries, the older woman cut to the heart of the matter. "You still have so much to offer, Emma," she said firmly, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Your injury took away your ability to dance, but it didn't take your knowledge, your passion. There are young girls who need what you can teach them." Emma shook her head. "I can't teach. I can't even look at a dance studio without." Her voice cracked, and she swallowed the tears threatening to spill. "I know it feels impossible now," Madame Lena said softly. "But you're more than just a dancer, Emma. You're a guide. You have something real to share with the next generation. Don't let this defeat you." The words lingered long after their meeting, stirring something deep inside Emma. Could she still be part of the world she loved, even if she wasn't performing? Could she pass on her knowledge to others? Emma didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time since her fall, she allowed herself to consider a new path. Perhaps the end of her dancing career didn't mean the end of everything. Perhaps it was the beginning of something different. But what? She wasn't ready to embrace it fully. Not yet. The path forward was unclear, but Emma would soon find that her darkest hour would lead her to a place she hadn't yet imagined. Her journey was just beginning. Weeks passed, but the heavy cloud of despair still hung over Emma like a shadow. Every day felt the same, endless and purposeless. She would wake up, stare at the empty ballet shoes by her bedside, and feel the familiar ache in her chest. The curtains in her apartment were drawn tight, keeping the world outside at bay. The only company she kept was the constant dull throb in her ankle, reminding her of everything she had lost. She had ignored most of her friends' calls, feeling too ashamed to face them. Who was she without ballet? What could she possibly say to them? But eventually, even Emma realized she couldn't stay locked in her apartment forever. One afternoon, a knock on her door startled her out of her numb state. She hesitated, debating whether to answer. The knocking persisted. "Emma, open up, it's Sophia." Sophia had been her best friend since their early ballet days. She had been the one to push Emma during rehearsals, to celebrate every achievement, and even to cry with her after grueling training sessions. Ignoring Sophia wasn't an option anymore. With a sigh, Emma dragged herself to the door and opened it just a crack. Sophia's eyes widened as she took in the state of Emma's disheveled hair and dark circles under her eyes. "You look like you haven't seen sunlight in weeks." "I'm coming in." She pushed the door open and marched inside, bringing with her an energy Emma had long forgotten. Sophia placed a paper bag of groceries on the counter, then turned to face Emma, arms crossed. "Enough is enough. I know this has been hell for you, but you're still here, Em. You're still you." Emma sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Am I? I don't even know who I am anymore." Sophia sat beside her, the usual fire in her eyes softening with concern. "You're still the girl who made me work twice as hard just to keep up. You're still the most passionate dancer I've ever known. Just because you're not on stage doesn't mean all of that disappears. I'm not a dancer anymore, sophomore. I can barely walk some days. That doesn't mean you're done." Sophia's voice was firm but kind. "Do you remember what Madame Lena said? You still have so much to offer. You can teach, Emma." "I don't know if I can. I don't even want to look at a dance studio," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "It hurts too much." Sophia reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I get it. I really do. But, hiding from the world won't make that pain go away. It's only going to make it worse." The words stung because they were true. Emma knew it. But how could she start over when everything she'd worked for had been taken away? Sophia leaned back against the couch, her gaze softening. "You know, when I was recovering from my ankle injury a few years ago, I thought it was the end of my career, too. I was angry, lost, but I found something new." Emma glanced at her, surprised. "You never told me that." Sophia smiled, a little sadly. "I didn't want to worry you back then, but it was rough. I couldn't dance at full capacity for almost a year. I started teaching at a small studio just to fill the time. At first, I hated it. It reminded me of everything I couldn't do anymore. But then, I don't know, I started seeing how much those kids looked up to me, how much they loved dancing." Emma's chest tightened. "And it didn't hurt? Watching them do what you couldn't?" Sophia nodded slowly. "At first, yeah. It felt like I was losing a part of myself every time I walked into that studio. But then something changed. I realized that helping them love ballet was a new way for me to be part of it. I wasn't on stage anymore, but I was still part of the magic." Emma was quiet for a long time, letting Sophia's words settle in. She could see how teaching might help ease the pain, but the fear of stepping back into a studio still held her back. How could she guide others when she felt so lost herself? A few days after Sophia's visit, Emma sat by her window, staring out at the quiet street below. She had begun venturing out little by little. trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. But the dread still lingered in her heart. The idea of teaching gnawed at her, pulling her in two directions. One part of her wanted to try, to see if she could rediscover her love for ballet in a different way. The other part was terrified of confronting the life she'd lost. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. A message from Madame Lena. "Emma, I know it's hard, but you need to take the first step. The studio is always open for you. We have students who could learn so much from you. Give it a try. You might be surprised at what you find." Emma stared at the message, her heart racing. Could she really do it? Could she walk back into the world of ballet without crumbling under the weight of her memories? The next morning, she found herself standing outside Madame Lena's studio. The familiar sounds of laughter and ballet music drifted from inside. She hesitated, her hands trembling as they hovered over the door handle. The thought of stepping inside, of seeing the mirrored walls and the bar, filled her with a deep ache. But a small part of her, the part that had been buried under grief and fear, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was where her new beginning could start. She pushed open the door. The warm scent of wood floors and the faint hum of classical music welcomed her. Emma stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. Inside, a group of young dancers were at the bar, moving through their warm-up exercises with the clumsiness of beginners. Madame Lena noticed her and smiled softly, giving a slight nod as if to say, "Welcome back." Emma stood there, watching the dancers for a moment. Something inside her shifted. She wasn't the one dancing anymore, but seeing the spark in those girls' eyes, the same spark she had carried once, reminded her that ballet wasn't lost to her. It had simply changed form. Maybe, just maybe, she could still be a part of this world. "Emma," Madame Lena called over the music. "Come help me with this group. They could use someone like you." Taking a deep breath, Emma crossed the threshold. The first step was always the hardest, but it was the beginning of something new. Maybe it was time to share her passion with the next generation. Time to help them soar where she could no longer fly. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. Emma's steps into the studio were slow and hesitant, but each one felt like a small victory. The air was thick with memories. The sound of pointe shoes brushing the floor, the sharp corrections of instructors, the exhilaration of mastering a new movement. She hadn't realized just how much she had missed the studio until she stood there, watching the young girls fumble their way through a basic plie. Madame Lena waved her over, her eyes glinting with quiet encouragement. "They're a bit rough around the edges," she said in a low voice, nodding toward the group. "But that's where you come in. You'll remember, Emma, the magic happens in the details." Emma's heart raced. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the bar, where 5 young girls were working on their form, some clearly struggling. Their faces were bright, eyes filled with eagerness, though their limbs were awkward and uncoordinated. She hesitated, unsure of what to say or do. How could she, broken as she was, possibly help these girls when she could barely help herself? One of the girls, a petite brunette with her hair in a messy bun, caught her eye. She looked nervous, biting her lip as she struggled to keep her legs straight. Her movements were stiff, as if she were afraid to take up space. Emma's heart softened. She saw her younger self in that girl, nervous, unsure, but so desperate to excel. Without thinking, Emma knelt beside her. "What's your name?" The girl looked startled, but managed a soft reply. "Mia." Emma smiled gently. "You're doing really well, Mia. But here's a little tip. When you're at the bar, don't think of the floor pulling you down. Think of the sky pulling you up. Imagine your body is light, as if you could float. Relax your shoulders, let go of the tension, and feel the freedom in your movement." Mia blinked up at her, uncertain but willing to try. She adjusted her stance, following Emma's instructions. Slowly, the stiffness in her posture softened, and her movements became more graceful. "Like that," Emma said with a nod. "You've got it." Mia's face lit up with a wide smile, and something inside Emma shifted. For the first time since her injury, she felt a flicker of the joy that ballet had always brought her. Not through her own body this time, but through someone else's. The rest of the class moved by in a blur. Emma floated between the girls, correcting posture, offering encouragement, and gently guiding them through the movements. She could see the spark in each of them, the hunger to improve, the way they absorbed her words as if they were precious jewels. When the lesson ended, Madame Lena came up behind her. "How did that feel?" Emma hesitated, unsure how to put the experience into words. "It was different, but it felt good." Madame Lena nodded. "You see? You still have a place in this world, Emma. You just have to see it from a different angle." As the students packed up their bags, chatting excitedly about the class, one of the girls, Mia, lingered behind. She approached Emma shyly, twisting the strap of her bag in her hands. "Miss Emma?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma turned and smiled at her. "Yes, Mia. I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know if I'm good enough to be a real ballerina, but when you helped me today, it made me feel like maybe I could be." A lump rose in Emma's throat. She knelt down to Mia's height, her heart swelling with emotion. "You already are a ballerina, Mia. It's not about perfection. It's about loving the dance, about showing up and giving your best every day. That's what makes you a ballerina." Mia's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and hope. Emma watched her leave, feeling an unexpected warmth bloom inside her chest. As she packed up to leave, a familiar voice echoed in the doorway. "Emma." She turned, surprised to see a tall man standing in the entrance, a violin case slung over his shoulder. His brown eyes held a gentle warmth that immediately put her at ease. "Caleb." She blinked in surprise, recognizing him from a performance she had given years ago. He had been one of the orchestra musicians, always quiet, always tucked away in the pit with his violin, but he had stood out to her with his soulful playing. "I heard you were teaching now," Caleb said, stepping into the studio. "It's good to see you back. The girls are lucky to have you." Emma's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm still trying to figure it all out," she admitted. "It's harder than I thought." Caleb gave her a kind smile, setting his violin case down. "You'll get there. Trust me. I know what it's like to lose something you thought would be your whole life." Emma tilted her head, intrigued. "You? I thought you were still playing." He nodded, his gaze growing distant. "I was. But a few years ago, I injured my hand. I can still play, but not at the level I used to. For a while, I thought my career was over." Emma felt a pang of recognition. His story echoed her own. How did you get through it?" Caleb shrugged, though his eyes held the weight of the journey. "I had to find new ways to love music. I started composing, teaching, working with younger musicians. At first, I resented it. It wasn't the same. But over time, I realized that I could still be part of the music world, just in a different way." His words sank deep into Emma's heart. There was something comforting about knowing that someone else understood the loss, the fear, the uncertainty of starting over. "I guess we're both learning to live again," she said softly. Caleb chuckled. "Yeah, I guess we are. But that's not a bad thing, is it? Life is a way of surprising you when you least expect it." As they stood there, in the quiet of the studio, Emma felt a connection spark between them, one born of shared pain, but also of hope. Caleb wasn't just a friendly face from the past. He was someone who understood the struggle of rebuilding a life after losing the dream that once defined it. "Maybe," Emma hesitated, but then took a breath. "Maybe we could help each other figure it out." Caleb's eyes lit up. "I'd like that." For the first time in months, Emma felt the weight on her heart begin to lift. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Life had taken her dreams of ballet away, but it was offering something new in return, a chance to teach, to inspire, and maybe, just maybe, to love again. As she left the studio that night, walking side by side with Caleb, Emma realized that her journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Over the next few months, Emma slowly found her rhythm in her new life. Teaching ballet wasn't the same as performing, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. The young girls in her class grew more confident with each passing week, their once clumsy steps becoming graceful, filled with the same passion Emma had once felt as a student. And then there was Caleb. After that first conversation, they started spending more time together, not just in the studio but outside of it. He'd come by with his violin after her classes, and they'd sit on the worn wooden floor, talking for hours about their shared experiences, the heartbreak of losing their dreams, and the tentative hope that came from discovering new paths. Emma felt lighter around him, his quiet strength a comfort in the midst of her uncertainty. One evening, they sat together on the studio floor, the fading light of the sunset casting long shadows across the room. Caleb had his violin in his hands, playing softly as Emma leaned back against the bar, closing her eyes and letting the music wash over her. His playing was still beautiful, though different from how she remembered it. Less precise, but filled with a raw emotion that stirred something deep inside her. "You play like you're telling a story," Emma said softly, opening her eyes as the last note faded into the quiet. Caleb smiled, lowering his violin. "I guess that's what music is, isn't it? A way to tell stories without words." Emma nodded, feeling a strange warmth bloom in her chest. "I think that's why I love ballet so much. It wasn't just about the steps, it was about telling a story through movement. I felt like I could say things with my body that I couldn't with words." "You still can," Caleb said, his gaze steady on her. "Just in a different way now." She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "It's hard sometimes, to let go of what I thought my life would be." Caleb set his violin down and shifted closer to her. "I know. It's like mourning a part of yourself. But I think we don't have to let go completely. It's more about finding a new way to keep that part of us alive." Emma looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of everything she hadn't allowed herself to say. Caleb had become more than just a friend over these months. He had become her anchor, the person who reminded her that life still held beauty, even after loss. But the fear of getting close again, of risking her heart, lingered. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her bag, jolting her out of the moment. She pulled it out and frowned at the name on the screen, Mark. Her ex-boyfriend had been radio silent since the day he walked out of her life. Seeing his name now, months after the breakup, sent a flood of old memories rushing back. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button. "Everything okay?" Caleb asked, noticing the change in her expression. It's Mark," Emma said, her voice tight. "He hasn't called since he left, and now." Caleb's brow furrowed with concern, but he didn't press her. "Do you want to answer it?" Emma stared at the phone for a few more seconds before shaking her head. "No, not right now." She silenced the call and slipped the phone back in her bag, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. Mark's sudden reappearance in her life stirred emotions she thought she had moved past, but now the wounds felt fresh again. "Hey," Caleb's voice was soft, grounding her in the present. "You don't have to talk to him if you're not ready." Emma nodded, but a part of her still felt the pull of unfinished business. I thought I was over it. But hearing from him, it brings everything back. The way he left when I needed him most, it still hurts." Caleb reached out, gently brushing his fingers against hers. "It's okay to feel that way. But remember, you're not the same person you were when he left. You've grown. You've built something new." Emma looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Caleb's words were a balm to the raw ache she hadn't fully acknowledged. She wasn't the broken woman Mark had walked out on. She had rebuilt her life, piece by piece, even when it felt impossible. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her past lingering between them. Finally, Emma exhaled and spoke. "I think I'm ready to talk to him. Not to go back, but to close that chapter for good." Caleb nodded, his eyes understanding. "If you need me, I'm here." The next day, Emma dialed Mark's number, her hand trembling slightly as she waited for him to pick up. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the windows of her apartment. When his voice came through the line, it felt like a punch to the gut. "Emma," he said, his tone surprised but soft. "I didn't think you'd call." She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stay calm. "I didn't think I would either. But here we are." There was a pause, and Emma could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Look, I know I messed up. I should have been there for you. But I didn't know how to deal with everything. I panicked." Emma closed her eyes, the familiar sting of old wounds surfacing. "You left me, Mark. When everything fell apart, you walked away." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I regret it every day." For a moment, Emma wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to yell, to tell him that regret wasn't enough to undo the hurt. But another part of her, the one that had healed over the months, knew that she couldn't carry that anger any longer. "I'm not calling to rehash the past," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'm calling because I need to move on. You hurt me, but I'm not the same person I was back then. I've rebuilt my life, and I'm happier now than I thought I'd ever be." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Mark spoke, his voice soft with resignation. "I'm glad to hear that, Emma. I really am. You deserve to be happy." She exhaled, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over her. "Goodbye, Mark." She hung up, the weight of their past slipping away like a burden she had carried too long. For the first time, she felt free. That evening, Emma went to the studio, her steps lighter than they had been in months. Caleb was already there, waiting with his violin. When she walked in, he looked up, and she saw the question in his eyes. "It's done," she said simply, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm done with him, and I'm ready for whatever comes next." Caleb's eyes softened, and without a word, he began to play. The music filled the room, swirling around them like a warm embrace. Emma closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, and in that moment, she knew she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living again, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to love again too. The days began to blur into a gentle rhythm for Emma. Teaching her ballet classes became more than just a job. It became her sanctuary. She watched as the young girls she taught blossomed, their movements becoming more fluid, their passion for ballet igniting something within her that she thought had been lost forever. But even beyond the studio, life was changing in other, unexpected ways. Her connection with Caleb deepened. It wasn't just the shared history of lost dreams that bonded them. It was the way he made her feel like she was capable of more. Their evenings spent talking, laughing, and sharing music became the brightest parts of her days. And the more time she spent with him, the more Emma realized that something new was growing between them, something that scared her, but also filled her with hope. One crisp autumn evening, after a particularly rewarding day of classes, Caleb suggested they take a walk through the park. The golden leaves crunched under their feet as they wandered along the path, the cool air filled with the scent of damp earth and the sound of distant laughter. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Caleb finally broke it. "You seem lighter lately," he said, his voice warm. "Like you've let go of something heavy." Emma smiled softly, glancing up at the trees. "I think I have. For so long, I was holding on to everything I lost. The dream of being on stage, the idea of who I thought I needed to be. But now, I've realized I can still have a beautiful life, even if it looks different than I imagined." Caleb nodded, his gaze steady on her. "You've rebuilt yourself, Emma, and that's no small thing." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster. "I couldn't have done it alone, you know. You've been here every step of the way." He smiled, that familiar, gentle smile that made her feel safe. "I'm just glad I could be part of it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The park seemed to close in around them, the rest of the world fading into the background. Emma felt her pulse quicken, her heart racing with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. something fragile and new, but undeniably real. She took a breath, her eyes searching his. "Caleb, I think I'm ready." His brow furrowed slightly. "Ready for what?" "For this," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "For us." Caleb's expression softened, and in that moment, Emma saw the depth of his feelings for her. It had been there all along, in the way he looked at her, in the gentle way he always listened, in the quiet moments they shared. He had been waiting for her, never pushing, never asking for more than she was ready to give. "I've been waiting for you," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. His touch was warm, steady, like a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. Emma's heart fluttered as she felt the weight of his words. She had been so afraid to open herself up to the possibility of love again, afraid that she would lose herself the way she had before. But with Caleb, it felt different. It felt like she was finding a new part of herself, a part she didn't even know existed. And as they stood there in the fading light of the autumn evening, Emma realized that she was no longer the woman who had been shattered by her injury. She was stronger now, not because she had reclaimed her old dreams, but because she had found new ones. Caleb gently pulled her closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Emma, I don't want to rush you, but I think you know how I feel. I've cared about you for a long time. But more than that, I respect you. I respect what you've been through, and I'm in awe of who you've become." His words sank deep into her heart, filling her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to have everything figured out. What she had now, this moment, this connection with Caleb, was enough. "I've been afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of getting hurt again. Afraid of losing myself like I did with Mark." Caleb's hand gently cupped her cheek, his touch reassuring. "You won't lose yourself, Emma. You've already found who you are. And whatever happens, I'll be here, beside you, as you continue to figure it out." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma felt whole. She had walked through the darkest parts of her life, and had come out the other side, stronger and more sure of who she was. She smiled through her tears. "I'm ready to try. With you." Caleb's smile matched hers, filled with a quiet joy. He leaned down, and as his lips brushed hers, Emma felt the world fall away. It wasn't the grand, sweeping love she had imagined in her younger years. It was something deeper, something quieter, but far more real. When they pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "You and me," he whispered. "We'll figure it out." Emma laughed softly, her heart light. "Yeah, we will." In the weeks that followed, Emma and Caleb grew even closer, their lives intertwining in ways that felt effortless. Caleb continued to compose and teach music, while Emma's ballet school flourished. Word of her teaching spread, and soon her classes were filled with eager young students, all of them drawn to her not just because of her skill, but because of the way she taught them to love dance. She didn't just teach them technique. She taught them resilience, passion, and the importance of following their hearts. One evening, as the two of them sat on the steps outside the studio, watching the sunset, Caleb turned to her with a smile. "I've been thinking, what if we created something together?" Emma raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "A performance," he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "A combination of your students dancing and my music. Something we can build from the ground up, together." Emma's heart swelled at the idea. It felt like the perfect blend of their worlds, a way to honor both of their passions. "I love that," she said, her voice full of excitement. "Let's do it." And so they did. Over the next few months, they worked together to create a performance that would showcase not only the beauty of ballet, but the resilience of the human spirit. It wasn't about perfection. It was about the journey, about finding joy in unexpected places. The night of the performance arrived, and as Emma stood backstage, watching her students prepare, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had come so far from the woman she had been when she first stepped into the studio. She had found a new purpose, a new path, and, most unexpectedly, a new love. As the music began to play and her students danced across the stage, Emma smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of the next chapter of her life. She had learned that dreams didn't die. They just transformed, becoming something even more beautiful than she had imagined. And with Caleb by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. The lights dimmed, and the final note of Caleb's violin lingered in the air, a promise of new beginnings. Emma looked out at the audience, her heart full, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her story, once broken, was now whole, and the future, once dark, now shimmered with endless possibilities.